Hello everyone, Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's show. We have Dr. Pratinav Anil, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Oxford. He is going to talk on a very elite betrayal, Muslim politics in post-colonial India, 1947 to 2024. So I will not say beyond this because there is a quite long introductory remark by Dr. Mujibur Rahman, who is a faculty at Jamia Millia Islamia. He's on a flight, so he couldn't join in time. Probably he will join in later period. So Haris is going to play that video, the introductory remark video for us. Haris?
Okay, madam.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you, Raji Sahab, for putting together this very important talk by Dr. Pratinav Anil. As many of you are aware, he is currently teaching at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Anil is the author of a widely read book called Another India, The Making of a Minority, 1947 to 1977. He is also a co-editor of another important volume called India's First Dictatorship, 1975 to 1977. This he has co-edited with Professor Christoph Jaffrelot, one of the foremost scholars working on South Asia today. I had the opportunity of writing a review of his book in his first dictatorship for the Frontline magazine. While Dr. Anil has stopped in 1977 while writing these volumes, today he has expanded his time period and he's not going to stop in 1977, but he will reflect up to the current year since independence. So he's going to speak on a topic titled An Elite Betrayal, Muslim Politics in Postcolonial India, 1947 to 2024. As we all are generally aware that ever since the rise of Hindu nationalism, all the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party in Indian politics since late 1980s, there has been great interest to study and understand Indian Muslim question, mainly because politics of the Hindu right is centered around the Muslim question or issues related to Muslims. But the intensity of these concerns has grown tremendously since the arrival of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2014. As his government settles down to govern India for the third term, there are deep concerns among secularists about the possible approach that the new BJP government would undertake with regard to Muslims. The major reason for this is that the new government that has come to power, based on the results of the just concluded 2024 general election, has witnessed perhaps the most Islamophobic campaign in Indian electoral history since the first one held in 1952. So much so that the former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, who has practically retired from public life, had to release a statement saying that Prime Minister Modi has lowered the dignity of Prime Minister's office during the campaign. One of the stories of Muslim politics is about Muslim backwardness. There are, of course, several layers to Muslim politics, and this is one of them, is one of the prominent of them. And this is where the story of discrimination comes into picture. There is a growing body of research that indicates that Muslim backwardness issue has worsened with the rise of Hindu right politics or the BJP's domination. Some find it alarming. But there is another body of scholarship that suggests that there is nothing new about it because this is how it has been since the early days of Republic. In my view, there are empirical evidences to show, as Dr. Anil's work does, about the continuity of sustained discrimination, even in the so-called golden days of Indian secularism. Nevertheless, there is a difference. The difference is about the intent of the government and the context of the politics. I have offered a narrative on this particular dimension in a chapter titled The Unending Debate over Muslim Backwardness in my recently published book, Sikh-Via Hind, The Political Future of Indian Muslims, Simon Schuster, 2024. In November 1888, Lord Dufferin, wrote, Muslims of British India, a nation of 50 million, reign supreme from the Himalayas to Cape Comorin. In contemporary India, the Muslim demographic has swelled to more than fourfold since Lord Dufferin's era. It now surpasses the combined populations of Britain and France together. Despite this, Indian Muslims find themselves standing helplessly at the heart of a violent triangle marked by lynching, bulldozer justice, and riots under Bharatiya Janata Party regime, particularly since 2014. Notably, a majority of Muslims have collectively excelled in relief at the outcome of the 2024 elections. The BJP has been deprived of a majority of its own, a departure from the 2014 and 2019 elections. Consequently, India has reverted to a coalition era. Some view India's reversion to a coalition era as a glimmer of hope for the rejuvenation of its beleaguered secular polity. However, for the Hindu right organizations, as I write in my book, Muslims are perceived as a problem, a threat, and even as an internal enemy. The Hindu majoritarianism, inspired by Hindutva ideology, scrutinizes every aspect of Muslim life, from azan to the dietary preferences such as beef, attire like burqa/hijab, places of religious instruction such as madrasas, the legal standing of religious establishments like dargahs or masjids, among others. For the Hindu right apprehensions, I would like to argue about these particular matters stem from a broader objective of de-Islamization of India. It is in this context the discussion of Muslim politics since 1947 to 2024 acquires tremendous scholarly significance. Some of the following questions I think may be of interest to the general as well as scholarly audience. What is indeed a Muslim politics? Or how Muslim is India's Muslim politics? Or what sort of Muslimness it represents? Since India aspired to be a secular nation at the birth of republic, what was then the need for a Muslim politics? Or what is the need for Muslim politics today? What has the rise of Hindutva politics done to Muslim politics? What lessons that Indian politics could learn from the failed secular politics that Muslim interests could be protected without pursuing Muslim politics? Is Muslim politics a universal need for Indian democracy? Or is there a difference between the kind of Muslim politics that happens in northern India or in southern India?
I think Haris maybe stop it. That's good enough. And so welcome. Now it is our privilege to invite Dr. Pratinav Anil for the talk.
Right, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, if a rather abrupt one. So I'm told in the US it's considered good form to begin a talk by reflecting on one's positionality, that is, by laying one's cards on the table. So before I tell you about my research, let me lay mine. So I came of age, politically speaking, in the last years of the Congress regime, the one that preceded Modi. And like so many young people growing up in a liberal Anglophone household, as raised in a diet of liberal triumphalism, the kind of story about Indian democracy one finds in Ramchandra Guha's books, or Amartya Sen's, or Pratinav Anil Mehta's. So what unites all of these accounts is that they tell a rather hopeful, optimistic story about Indian democracy. And in some sense, it's also a morality tale. So the Congress is the party of the good guys. The founding fathers stood for secularism, equality. They won us independence. And on balance, they did a pretty good job writing the Constitution, defending institutions, and heeding minorities. So the BJP in this story is the party of the bad guys. So since they've been in power, they've made a mockery of minority rights and incited riots. They've abused power and undermined the free press, the judiciary, the civil service. So this, in a nutshell, is the worldview I took with me when I left for university in 2013. So you can imagine Modi's victory the following year came as something of a shock to me. So how had so many Indians fallen prey to a leader who was, so I then believed, the very antithesis of what is meant to be an Indian? And I suppose everything I've written over the last 10 years has been my attempt to come to terms with the seeming paradox, that of a liberal democracy with deeply illiberal characteristics. My first book, as was mentioned in the introduction, was a history of the so-called emergency, written with the French political scientist Christophe Jaffrelot. And in that book, we challenged the conventional narrative of Indira Gandhi's dictatorship of the mid-70s, which has it that those 2 years were something of an aberration, a blip in India's long march of ever-deepening, ever-strengthening democracy. But our book gave a slightly bleaker view of Indian democracy. So looking at the emergency in the longue durée, we saw more continuities than discontinuities. We noticed, for example, that in Nehru's India, trade unions were very much creatures of the Congress, that there's no real independent labor movement to begin with. And much the same can be said about the use of preventive detention to lock up dissidents. Nehru made use of it in the 1950s, so did Indira Gandhi in the 60s, and indeed various governments that have followed since. And similarly, there's no free speech to speak of in the 1950s. And this is because all newspapers received public funding and they depended on it in great measure. So journalists and editors felt compelled to be in the ruling government's good books. And this, it hardly needs saying, is equally and dispiritingly true of Modi's India as well. So our argument, in short, was that the emergency was no aberration. It was rather a concentrate of a singularly Indian style of rule, alive at the time of independence as it is today. And now with my second book, I set out to do for Indian secularism what I did for Indian democracy with the previous one, which is to say I set out to look at the continuities between then and now. So since 2014, the Muslim question, as you well know, has become particularly urgent, what with riots, the new citizenship law, the war on love jihad, and so on. But how new are these developments? These days, we're repeatedly told that there's once a golden age of secularism, that a secular India has given way to a Hindu India, that toleration has been replaced by majoritarianism. But having spent the last few years studying mid-century Muslim politics in the archives, I think I have it on good authority that this story isn't entirely true. So as it is, much of this version of events comes from Nehru's own writings or from hagiographic accounts of him. And I think we should be suspicious of sources like this. So a rather different picture emerges if you peruse the archives of the Times of India or look at magazines like Link and Radiance. So using these sources along with the private papers and memoirs of Muslim leaders like Saeed Mahmood and Humayun Kabir, I was able to conclude that minority rights were at a discount right from independence. So that despite its best intentions, the Congress was often illiberal, intolerant, and undemocratic, that right from independence, India's Muslims had to contend with discrimination, disadvantage, disenfranchisement, and also more importantly, an unresponsive leadership. I have called this the Ashraf betrayal of working Muslims after the Muslim upper caste. And for those unfamiliar with stratification in Islam, you're not alone. So in the public imagination, the caste system tends to be synonymous with Hinduism. But we would do well to remember that Islam and Christianity in South Asia are no strangers to caste. So you have the Ashraf right at the top, the low caste Ajlaf below them, and the outcast Arzal right at the bottom. Like Dalits, they too were considered untouchable. And as in Hinduism, caste and class more or less map onto one another in Islam. So just as it is possible to speak of a Brahmanical elite among Hindus, there exists an Ashraf elite among Muslims. And this is the stratum from which the Muslim political elite is drawn. And I say they betrayed their poorer brethren because of the kind of politics they prioritized. So they plumbed for what I think were noble but ultimately symbolic causes that had rather little bearing on the lives of ordinary Muslims. So the Hajj, for instance, Sharia law, Muslim endowments, Urdu, the protection of Muslim monuments. So it seems to me that there's no room for mass politics and collective solidarity in this version of Muslim politics. And I think it's important to recognize this elite betrayal, not only because it sheds light on the workings of Indian democracy, but also because India's 200 million Muslims live with its consequences today. So more importantly, the Ashraf betrayal shows that class has always mattered a lot more than religion in India. So it is unsurprising that Muslim royals and landlords did rather well in Nehru's India, whereas working class Muslims fared rather badly. But before I sketch a general outline of this betrayal, let me say this. My point here is not to blame Muslims for the predicament they find themselves in today. Far from it. Throughout my book, in fact, I place emphasis on the rather difficult circumstances Muslims had to contend with after partition. So in the language of sociology, I look at both agency and structure. Yet I find narratives that solely stress Muslim plight and oppression unconvincing, not least because, first, a number of other subaltern groups, say the OBCs and Dalits, have managed to find creative ways to organize over the last 70 years. And second, because the Congress regime wasn't as terrible as some of its critics let on. So this might seem surprising given the general tenor of my book, but I think this is worth stressing all the same. So there are unquestionably considerable similarities between Nehru's India and Modi's India when it comes to Islamophobia, but it is also clear that the former was the lesser evil, that the Islamophobia of the BJP is of a different magnitude altogether. Indeed, I think there's a lot to credit Nehru and the bureaucracy for in steering India away from the seductions of majoritarian rule after independence. So Nehru himself was something of an island of secular hope in an Islamophobic ocean. And what's more, many in the party saw themselves as protectors of the Muslim community. And not without good reason. So in Nehru's India, 4 in 5 Muslim lawmakers in parliament happened to be congressmen. And there were no major riots in the country before 1959. And Nehru saw through the repeal of the Evacuee Property Act, which impounded property owned by Muslims as enemy assets. Now, as the political scientist Aaron Liphart has it, Nehru's India was a consociational democracy. So there was, he argues, a power-sharing arrangement at work in post-colonial India. Muslims enjoyed a minority veto that granted them juridical autonomy. So this is less arcanely known as Muslim personal law. And Muslims were also inducted into legislatures, cabinets, and public institutions. But this is an incomplete picture. So we also need to look at the other side of the balance sheet. Fewer Muslims made it to Nehruvian legislatures than any other parliament before Modi. Hindi was made the sole official language in northern states to the exclusion of Urdu. And Muslims were fired en masse from the bureaucracy. So in UP, for instance, nearly 90% of them were shown the door. And more than 40,000 were killed by Nehru's military governors after the invasion of Hyderabad. And in the Constituent Assembly, Dalits were reserved seats, but not Muslims. And 1 in 50 Indian Muslims emigrated to Pakistan after the Hazrat Bal riots of 1963. So put differently, the agency of Muslim elites was constrained after partition, but it is important to remember that they had some agency all the same. And what did they do with it? It seems to me that they squandered it on identity politics. And to understand why they did this, we need to study the very origins of modern Muslim politics in India. In particular, the development of a rather quaint figure, the nationalist Muslim. So these were figures committed to the devolution of political power from the 1920s on, and later to Indian independence. So rather naturally, most of them came to identify with the Congress. And because the Congress was the largest party in the country for well over 50 years, and ruled virtually uninterruptedly from 1937 to 1989. These were the only Muslim voices that were heard. So it's fair to say then that the nationalist Muslim was the most powerful Muslim force in modern Indian history. So it's important to understand the worldview, the assumptions they made about politics, and the manner in which they shaped Muslim politics in the interwar period. So there are, I argue in my book, three important strands in the nationalist Muslim worldview. So first, they conflated national interest and party interest. So to them, the Congress was India, as it were. And second, they had a rather self-effacing political style. So they blamed partition on the hot-headed politics of the Muslim League. So you could say that theirs was essentially a politics of guilt, which is why they presented their political demands with restraint, preferring to appear accommodating and not implacable like the Muslim League. And third, they preferred cultural concerns over politics proper. So they had little interest in the economy, matters related to the state. So what really mattered to them was the autonomy of Sharia law, and perhaps understandably so, because so many of them happen to be clerics. Now, this is a rather rough schema, of course, and not all nationalist Muslims subscribe to this worldview, but I would wager that very many of them did. So their nemesis were what Francis Robinson has called separatist Muslims. And you get their worldview by turning all these three assumptions I've just outlined on the head. So where nationalist Muslims conflated party and nation, separatist Muslims believed Muslims were a nation in their own right. Where nationalist Muslims believed in quietist demands, separatists put forward maximalist ones. And from 1940 on, this meant a separate Muslim homeland. Where nationalist Muslims focused on culture, separatist Muslims focused on politics. They didn't care about Sharia law. They wanted secular law in a Muslim state. And they were all modernists. Some, like Jinnah, were hardly believers at all. So the 30 years to partition can essentially be seen as a dialectic between the nationalist and the separatist Muslim, between two very different understandings of Muslim politics. So the separatists were after quotas, political vetoes for minorities, and the nationalists, by contrast, spoke of Sharia law within a single Indian union, of unity in diversity. So as we know all too well, the separatists won the argument, but luckily for the nationalist Muslims, that also meant that they left for Pakistan, which is why, in a sense, you could say that the nationalist Muslims won the argument too. Because in post-colonial India, their influence in the Congress's Muslim policy was second to none. And the reason why this is the case is, I think, because of the simple fact that without the nationalist Muslims, there might have been no Congress to begin with. So the Congress's ideology is impossible to understand without analyzing the social roots of the late colonial Congress, in particular, the circumstances leading up to Gandhi's rise to power. So essentially, Gandhi's takeover of the Congress depended on three actors becoming reconciled to one another: Muslim clerics, Muslim notables, and Hindu Congress notables. So that they became reconciled has much to do with the manner in which devolution unfolded. So throughout the first half of the 19th century, Muslims had maintained a privileged position in government and the services. But as the century wore on, Muslims began losing their privileged position thanks to the majoritarian logic of numbers. So as the elective principle grew and a national public sphere emerged, Hindus became more assertive and revivalist movements took off. So this forced the Ashraf elite to exchange class for religious identity. And it also forced Ashraf leaders like M.A. Ansari and the Ali brothers to embrace mass politics, which they did by befriending Muslim clerics, as well as Hindu congressmen. Now, there was one minor snag. Right from the start, the Congress's mass politics relied on the trappings of Hindu traditionalism, and Hindu elites were happy to mobilize the hysteria around caste lot and conversion because, very simply, they needed to win local elections. So these were the kind of issues that went down well with the lower orders, since poor Hindus couldn't care less about civil service examinations being held in India or Britain. Now, Gandhi's genius lay in brigading together Hindu traditionalists with the Muslim elite without ever developing a common platform to appeal to both sides. So Gandhi's rhetoric turned on building a bridge between we Hindus and you Muslims, as he put it, and not building a sense of us Indians, as it were. So the guiding logic was quid pro quo, not solidarity, and Hindus were asked to back the Muslim demand to restore the power to the Ottoman Caliph. And Muslims in turn were asked to relinquish cow slaughter. So as Gandhi said to Muhammad Ali, I want to buy your friendship. And Bari saw things in similar terms. If we take from you, we must give to you, he wrote to Gandhi. So Muslim clerics, and especially the Firangi Mahal's Abdul Bari, were happy to go along because they saw this as an opportunity to create a Muslim state within a state, run by clerics at that. Now, it must be said that it was quite unusual, well, historically speaking, for Muslim clerics to back a secular nationalist movement. But I think it's quite easy to explain the Indian exception. So clerics at Deoband, Firangi Mahal, and elsewhere came around to the Congress because it promised, in the words of Peter Hardy, a historian, a juristic ghetto for Muslims in a free India. So this, of course, was not possible in a British India, with its pesky liberalism and separation of powers. So this was how the alliance between the Muslim clerics, Muslim notables, and Hindu congressmen was formed. And this was the alliance that thrust Gandhi into the driving seat of the nationalist movement. So in May 1920, he had failed to carry his party with him on non-cooperation. But a mere 4 months later in Calcutta, aided by an insurgency of clerics rallied by Bari, he had his way. So for the next 25 years, the Mahatma had the party in a vice-like grip. And Muslims, for their part, had become trusted partners of the government in waiting. Still, trouble lay ahead for them, and the alliance proved to be a rather short-lived affair. Quite a few of the Khilafat movement's leading lights died in the 1920s, and many others became embroiled in financial scandals. And with the expansion of the franchise, the League stole a march on them. So it began dabbling in religious affairs and making ever more implausible promises. And Jinnah managed to win over the local landed elites in India's northeast and northwest. And by the early 1940s, the League had transformed itself into a fearsome electoral machine. So the Congress, meanwhile, was increasingly marginalizing its Muslims and turning them into little more than window dressing. So when most of the provinces fell to it in 1937, it revealed itself to be little more than the party of Hindus. And this was no accident. Over 97% of its members were Hindu at this point. So the Muslim cleric Maulana Azad was the president of the Congress in the early 1940s. But I think he was utterly incapable of having his way in the party. So even his speeches and correspondence were vetted by Nehru and Gandhi. And as for the three nationalist Muslims in the interim government, they proved to be creatures of the high command too. So in Wavell's Baroque phrase, they exuded the cheap butter of insincere compliments. And by the time all parties came around to partition, nationalist Muslims were the only force against it, but it didn't matter. They'd already been consigned to political irrelevance. But then luck came their way with independence, and the separatists left for Pakistan, and at a stroke, the nationalist Muslims found themselves sought after by Hindu congressmen who were all of a sudden eager to win the Muslim vote. So just like the British before them, congressmen set about identifying the Muslim community's natural leaders, well, preferably bearded, modestly reactionary, unbendingly doctrinal, conveniently unworldly. And, well, Maulana Azad was one such figure, and by far the most important one. So, like the other nationalist Muslims, he loathed the rough and tumble of politics. Law was his forte, and what he wanted above anything was Islamic juridical sovereignty. So in the 1920s, his dream was to be crowned Amir-i-Hind, the just ruler of Muslim India, presiding over an ever-proliferating president of Sharia courts. Now, after independence, he wanted much the same thing, only within a Congress-ruled India rather than outside it. So there would be no territorial Islamic state, but instead, as it were, a legal Islamic state, Muslims governed by a separate legal code. And true to his clerical disposition, Maulana Azad sacrificed Muslim politics on the altar of Muslim law. So 1/4 of the quartet that wrote India's constitution, he blithely waved aside warnings of his Muslim colleagues, who argued that the distorting effects of first past the post would do a disservice to minorities. So likewise, when Leagueists suggested reserving seats not only for Dalits and tribes, but also for Muslims, he dismissed their concerns. So these amendments were duly shot down. And later he sat out the debate on proportional representation. So more important to him were legal matters. And here Azad was a different man, lobbying with the other clerics against a common civil code for Hindus and Muslims. And I think it is thanks to their efforts that Sharia found a place in secular India. So Muslims were allowed to conserve their marriage, divorce, and inheritance practices, including polygamy, unilateral divorce without alimony, and unequal inheritance, sons being entitled to twice the share passed on to daughters. And Azad's anti-political worldview rather neatly captures the Ashraf betrayal. So for one thing, it clearly shows how the nationalist Muslim elite squandered the minoritarian veto bestowed upon them by the Congress. And for another, it shows how much more invested they were in cultural than political safeguards. But still, seen in the round, what the nationalist Muslims achieved in the Constituent Assembly was nothing short of extraordinary. So more so when one remembers that the mid-century was an especially trying time for conservative Muslims everywhere, including in the Muslim world. So this was the age when statism was replacing Islamism. So everywhere Muslim laws were being torn up and rewritten. So in the United Arab Republic, for instance, in Tunisia, in neighboring Pakistan, but not so in India. So in 1964, the year of Nehru's death, the secular Indian Republic belonged to a rather small club of countries, along with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Indonesia, where polygamy enjoyed state sanction. So all the same, fixating on law at the expense of politics proper came at a cost, because it became a lot easier for the Congress High Command to ignore Muslim voices in the party. All the easier since there were fewer of them in Parliament. And Azad himself began to reconsider throwing in his lot with the Congress. So I suppose there's perhaps some truth in Jinnah's jibe that there's no more to him than him being a Muslim showboy of Hindu congressmen. And towards the end of his life, Azad called for reservations for Muslims, and he criticized his colleagues for turning a blind eye to riots. But by then it was too late. All Azad could do at this point was to pen his memoirs, a tell-all story of his humbling by congressmen. But unfortunately, he died before its publication, having spent the better part of the 50s boozing alone in his bedroom. So the manuscript landed in the lap of his trusted friend, Humayun Kabir, who betrayed his memory by alerting Nehru to a few controversial passages in the book. And Nehru had the offending passages removed, and a bowdlerized volume was published in 1959. And one can imagine Azad turning in his grave. So, as with Azad, so with Saeed Mahmood, who was the most important Muslim leader in the country after Azad's death. So Mahmood's memoirs too had been censored by Nehru and Gandhi, who objected to his account of the 1937 Congress government in Bihar, which was a rather Hindu nationalist affair, according to Mahmood. But like Azad, Mahmood swallowed his pride and subserviently played the part that was expected of him. So you can sample a line from Mahmood's correspondence with Nehru, and I quote, "I am painfully conscious of the worthlessness of my devotion, but then, my boy, just like a dog, I have nothing else or nothing better in my possession to give my master, a thought which sometimes makes me bitter and sad. Well, that is a thought that ought to make us sad. Well, despite his loyalty, he was dropped from the cabinet, and other Muslim politicians in the Congress had it just as bad. Indeed, what emerges from the archives is that 50s India was no country for Muslim politicians. They were routinely denounced as fifth columnists by Nehru's colleagues, and they were given intractable ministries, which is a polite way of putting them out to pasture. And it's no coincidence that many of them wound up in the food ministry, this at a time of famine and shortages. So one of them rightly described the ministry as a graveyard for politicians. But as the nationalist Muslims decided to stick with the Congress, well, they had to, because even in the meekness, they still managed to represent the community, because there were still some advantages to this. So they managed to inveigle some concessions from the country's Hindu leadership. So Sayyid Mahmud, for instance, used his relationship with Nehru to cut out the state and channel funds to Muslim rights victims. So others like Azad managed to turn their Rolodexes to good account by having Muslim friends nominated to political and cultural institutions. And yet others brought attention to instances of Islamophobia in government. But I think on balance, Muslims got the raw end of the bargain. So they gave the Congress much more than they received in return. So the Congress was legitimized as a secular, multi-confessional party thanks to their presence. But the Muslim politicians themselves were repeatedly stonewalled whenever they tried to influence policy. But still, if advancing Muslim interests from within the Congress was exasperating, doing so from outside the Congress was near impossible. And this, the All India Muslim League, which is heir to Jinnah's League, learned the hard way. So in the end, the League's greatest successes came in alliance with the Congress in the 1970s. Textbook reform, the construction of mosques and madrasas, the banning of offending books. And all this points to the simple fact that in early post-colonial India, the Congress was the only game in town. But this is not to suggest that Muslim politics was only so much wasted effort, quite the contrary. So they were influential, though in their own tangential fashion. So in this, I suppose they're not too different from the communist parties of France and Italy during the Cold War, neither of which came close to power, but nevertheless produced enough panic among center-right governments to put together a rather modest welfare state. So Muslim parties, similarly, indirectly influenced Congress rule. So this was the Red Scare with Indian characteristics, as it were, the Green Scare. So congressmen feared that Muslims were deserting their party, that they're being drawn to fanatical causes such as Islamism. So in response, they decided to spend. Faced with the rise of the AIMIM in Hyderabad, for instance, the Congress spent ₹1 million in policies that were specifically targeting unemployed Muslims. The Congress also pledged another $1 million for new Muslim-owned industries. And what's more, Andhra Pradesh became the first state where Urdu was formally recognized, despite North India having many more Muslim speakers, both in absolute and percentage terms. And a lot of AIMIM legislators and councillors were encouraged to defect to the Congress, and this increased their prospects of winning. So it ultimately brought more Muslims into government. So rather perversely then, a vote for Owaisi's party in Hyderabad was indirectly a vote for a more Muslim-friendly Congress. So as time wore on, though, Congress hegemony weakened, and it became a lot easier to contemplate, as many Muslim politicians did, a future without the Congress. And a step in that direction was the creation of a rather unusual organization that joined secularists and Islamists, congressmen and leaguers, clerics and career politicians. So this was the Majlis-e-Mushawarat, a pressure group founded in 1964. So the idea was to deliver the Muslim vote en bloc to candidates who signed its charter, essentially a list of clerical desiderata the lawmakers were to work towards, such as the protection of Sharia law, recognition of Urdu, the new legislation to ban alcohol, obscene literature, and immoral films. So the immediate provocation was the riot of 1963, provoked by the theft of a relic in Kashmir, a strand of hair from the Prophet Muhammad's beard. So several thousand Muslims were killed, and 800,000 Muslims, that is 1 in 50 Indian Muslims, left for Pakistan, completing the unfinished business of partition, as it were. And the Congress did precious little to put a lid on the violence, milking it instead for electoral mileage to polarize voters against the Jansang, the Hindu Nationalist Party to which the BJP is heir. There were also other long-standing grievances with Congress rule. There was, for example, the deportation to Pakistan of over 100,000 Muslims in the Northeast, and we typically think this only began in the 1970s, but as the archives show, this was already an important issue in the mid-50s. Then there's the Damocles sword of Article 44 committing India to a secular code of law. So such grievances could easily have translated into a political program for a party, but the Mushawarat categorically wasn't a party, it was a pressure group. So it sought to win over by lobbying. As it is, though, it failed to win over Muslims in appreciable numbers. And one may say this was because of its Ashraf elitism. So from its voting record in the assemblies, it seems that the Mushawarat was more preoccupied with Sharia and the Six-Day War in the Middle East than bread and butter issues, which they dismissed as, I quote, shallow materialism. So in the end, the Mushawarat's internal contradictions proved its undoing. Islamists and secularists couldn't coexist in a single outfit, and the Quranic worldview of its leaders did not do it any great service either, premised on austerity, sacrifice, individual belief, and strength of character. So none of this really belonged to the world of mass politics. And ultimately, such a worldview lent itself rather well to depoliticization, which is to say politics without politics. So the Mushawarat had no cadres or mass following to speak of. It was foremost a deal-making agency. And while this made sense in the age of Gandhi and Bari, when hardly 5% of Indians had the vote, it made no sense in an era of universal franchise. So by 1974, the Mushawarat had run out of steam. It lost relevance when its leader, Faridi, died. And I suppose all in all, the Mushawarat episode was something of an instructive one. It shows us that while the Muslim political classes do a pretty good job of counting heads and striking deals, they failed rather miserably at everything else. So their anti-political style and their Ashraf obsessions prevent them from mobilizing people and rallying their community behind them. And I think these are precisely the aspects of politics that the OBCs and Dalits have excelled in, unlike Muslims. So Muslim elites can afford to be cut off from the rest of the community, I think, because of their class position, thanks to which they've had a rather positive experience of post-colonial India. So unlike the Ajlaf and Arzal, they've landed on their feet. And this is because state neglect, political violence, and deindustrialization have scarcely affected them. And well, it's quite obvious that a certain kind of Muslim figure had no difficulty having governments here in the 1950s and 60s. And I'm thinking of the Mutawlis and Wasikadars, the landlords and royal pensioners, and more generally, Muslim men of independent means. So these were the kind of chaps who put their class position and practical intelligence and persuasive skills to good account. And you can take the predicament of the Muslim aristocrats. Most of them wound up with rather good sinecures in socialist India, a privy purse when most Indians were landless and penniless. So it's instructive to contrast the fate of the Nizam, that is the deposed king of Hyderabad and the richest man in Asia in the 1940s, with the fate of his Muslim subjects, some 40,000 of whom were killed in 1948. So year after year, his correspondence shows that Nizam managed to extract all manner of concessions from Nehru's government, tax exemptions, a renegotiated pension, money for his many wives, foreign exchange waivers, And in my estimate, he had about $250 million tied up in 28 trusts by the time of his death. And of course, he wasn't an exception. Much the same can be said about the other Muslim aristocrats. And time and again, they presented themselves as leaders of the Muslim community. And this was a claim that Delhi took at face value, and the state almost always gave into their demands. So ultimately, I think it's important to remember that while these figures may have been Muslims, they were above all monarchs. So if they spoke in the language of the community, the truth is they only acted in the interest of their class and, well, really just in the interest of their family and friends. So in my book, I also look at Aligarh, a town that is, in a way, a microcosm of the Indian Muslim world. So on the one hand, you have oligarchs, as it were, the staff and students at the university. And this was a university that was quite a posh affair, modeled on Cambridge famously. So here I push back against the idea the AMU's politics is Muslim politics, that the defense of the university's autonomy is the same thing as a defense of the minority rights of Muslims. So I show how it was really only the AMU court, that is its governing body, made up of members of the Uttar Pradesh's landed elite, that stood to benefit from the university's autonomous status. So even right next door in Aligarh town, few cared about this prized object of the Muslim elite. And why should they have cared? The AMU was, after all, a rather elite institution, established to be something like an old souls of Muslim India. So in my book, I contrast the painstaking lobbying for the AMU's minority status in its quadrangles and in parliament to life in Aligarh town, where every 5 years there's a major riot. So deindustrialization had pushed the bulk of its Muslims into poverty. But few at the university cared about their brethren on the other side. So in fact, the students were actively discouraged by vice-chancellors from engaging with the local population. So the chasm between town and gown was never bridged. So understandably, local Muslims felt rather bitterly about this Ashraf betrayal. So we sacrificed ourselves for the university, but the university did nothing for us, was what one of them told an anthropologist recently. So I think it's fair to conclude from the survey that Muslim politics, which is to say proper Muslim politics, has never been tried in post-colonial India. What we have witnessed instead is Ashraf politics, the politics of a small affluent segment of the community masquerading as Muslim politics at large. So this is essentially a case of elite capture. So we've seen intense political activity around a set of largely symbolic issues that are of importance to the Muslim elite, but hardly anyone else. So the nationalist Muslims use their proximity to Delhi's rulers to preserve Sharia law and secure sinecures for themselves, but they did precious little when they're given a chance to make India's political system more representative. So they were far more interested in textbooks, monuments, obscene literature, pornography, the Hajj, the Waqf regime, the Mutawlis, princes, polygamy, triple talaq, and so on. So this is not to suggest that the blame for the Muslim condition today rests entirely on the shoulders of elite Muslims. What I'm trying to do here instead is to explain why Muslim politics failed to take off in the manner that, say, Dalit and OBC politics did. So it's important to recognize that the Ashraf were also up against considerable odds after partition. So often it was quite impossible to advance Muslim interests in the face of such hostility from the government and the press. What Muslims were dealing with was a deeply conservative, confessional, and conformist society. And this is clearer to us in hindsight now that we've observed the ease with which one hegemony has given way to the next, the way in which Congress rule has been supplanted by the BJP rule. But minority Muslim politics in a Hindu democracy was always going to be a tough ask. But still, this doesn't take away from the shortcomings of the Muslim political operators themselves. So theirs was a juridical worldview. Politics was a bad word. It was all about Quranic precepts and constitutional articles. But the Muslim bosses had bigger fish to fry. And unsurprisingly, they had little time for these two holy books. So only the purely material politics of Dalits and the backward classes has been successful in India. And this, I think, is a lesson that Muslim politicians are yet to learn. But all the same, the reasons to be optimistic. So the anti-CAA protests of 2019 show that subaltern Muslims are indeed embracing their agency. And we witnessed some semblance of cross-community solidarity in the 2024 election as well, with Muslims voting overwhelmingly for the Congress Samajwadi Party alliance in Uttar Pradesh. Similarly, Muslims defected from the openly confessional AIUDF to the Congress in Assam, once again showing an openness to cross-confessional alliances. All the same, as much as I was heartened by the election result, I think it's worth pointing out that the India alliance isn't exactly a subaltern alliance. So in a recent speech, Rahul Gandhi thanked workers, farmers, Dalits, and OBCs for saving the constitution. Crucially, he omitted one group, and we know which group that is. And this was no accident. So even in Delhi, which witnessed some very gruesome riots in 2020, the Muslim predicament was barely mentioned on the campaign trail by the Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party. And nor was it mentioned in most party manifestos, the only exceptions being the DMKs and the CPMs. So the lesson all parties have taken is that Muslims can be ignored. And now we have only 24 Muslims in parliament. That is 3 less than in the previous BJP majority parliament of 2019. And the BSP leader has already said that it was a mistake to field 17 Muslim candidates in Uttar Pradesh. All of which is to say that it is perhaps too soon to declare the age of Ashraf politics over. So like most historians, I'm going to be very boring here and offer no predictions about the future of Muslim politics. All I know is that Muslim politics has a long way to go. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. So before we enter into question and answer, let's have the concluding remark by Dr. Hilal Ahmed. As you know, Dr. Hilal Ahmed is an associate professor at CSTS in Lokniti in Delhi, and he is much valued these days, especially commenting on the Indian election. And besides that, he has written a lot of books and articles. He is very well known on the international and national newspapers. His articles are very commonly seen. So welcome, Dr. Hilal Ahmed, and please have your 5 to 7 or 8 minutes concluding remarks. After that, we will go into question and answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is slight problem with my video, so video will appear very soon. I do hope so. Yeah. Let me switch off this one.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pratinav. Thank you, Razivai, for giving me this opportunity. It was important, first of all, first 30 seconds to congratulate Pratinav for such a bold way of looking at the question of Muslim politics. I had a privilege to write a blurb for his book, and I value the book. I read the book very carefully because it was just 45 minutes of time. So that's why you could not actually tell us the nuances which you have underlined in the book, which is a remarkable book. And I strongly suggest that we should all read the book, because what Pratinav has just said is, I would say, just 10% of the main argument. So therefore, it is very important for all of us to get back to the book. Here, the lecture which he delivered is actually the crux of it, and he tried to expand the argument he was making in the book. I do not want to make a longer sort of a comment, basically because this is Pratinav's seminar and my task is to summarize what he had already said. Two things, first 3 comments and then 2 questions. And these questions are not merely to you, Pratinav, but for all of us. So obviously, even for me, obviously these are important things to be discussed. First of all, let me first start with my comments. My first comment is about the kind of imagination he underlined while he was evoking the idea of elite betrayal. I think it is very important to look at which he touched upon, and this is my reading of his book. So therefore, what he said obviously is there in the book. As a reader, when I read the book and I listened to the lecture, I think he is trying to underline a very interesting complexity of Muslim identity in post-colonial India. And this Muslim identity is constituted of 2 elements. First is that there is an historical imagination that Muslims were ruler. And the second and quite paradoxical attribute of that identity is that they are the most poor and the marginalized. So how to combine these two? On the one hand, you have this imagination that they were the ruler of erstwhile. Obviously, all standard history textbook will tell you that it was the British who actually took the regime from the Muslims. And this view is uncritically accepted, imagining that the entire Muslim community was the ruler in the medieval India, which is not true. Even if you look at the historical records, and Pratinav is actually a historian, you find that Muslims were actually poor and marginalized even during the time of Akbar or Aurangzeb. There are many evidence. We don't have statistical data at that time, but there are many incidents which prove that Muslims, there were basically 2 types of Muslim: the elite and very powerful, those were huge, and then there is a majority of Muslim at the bottom level of society. Pratinav is actually trying to understand that complexity by making an argument, looking at the material which he has as a scholar collected and try to present in a very beautiful way. So that's first comment I would like to make, and we might have some question about it. My second comment is about the categories he has used in the book as well as in this lecture. 2 categories, the nationalist and the separatist, which you all know. And but if we really try to understand the ways in which Muslim politics functions in post-colonial India, is something which gives us a lot of things to think about. And Pratinav, at least in this lecture, tried to indicate a few things. For example, he is evoking the idea time and again of adherence to constitutionalism. And his argument is very provocative, and it is actually factually substantiable, because most of the Muslim elite politicians of 50s and 60s were basically trying to adhere to the idea of constitutionalism as a reference point. So this is also an important point of reference even now, and Pratinav is very beautifully argued that point in his lecture. Second is that he is also making a point with example to Aligarh, which is actually fascinating example, that there's a lot of emphasis on the idea of Muslim homogeneity. And this homogeneity is presented as if that if you do not try to assert yourself as one homogeneous community, there would be a danger and it will create problems for all of you. And that is a reference point for Muslim politicians all the time in 50s, 60s, and even in the 80s. So that's the second thing which he is trying to underline. So that's the second comment which I would like to make, that why that the idea of betrayal he is underlining in this lecture is what are the sources by which that idea of betrayal actually came into existence. So that's the second comment. My third comment is about the question which Mujib Bhai also raised, and Pratinav in his concluding remark also tried to answer, and that is, what is Muslim politics? In my view, and this is something which I have worked on for over 20 years now, for me, Muslim politics is actually a discourse. It's a very specific post-colonial discourse in which Muslim masses, Muslim elite, and even the non-Muslim elite participate and contribute. So Pratinav somehow also in his concluding remark tried to actually touch upon the question of that discourse. So, and he is making us aware of the complexities of the discourse by again evoking the idea of betrayal by the elite. So therefore, there is these are the three comments which, the two comments which I would like to, let me just elaborate this point and then I'll come to the questions. The point is, if it is a discourse, then what are the sources of this discourse? Because politics is a relational activity. It is a relational activity because you cannot do politics in a vacuum. You have to have certain kind of resources which you employ. And if we look at the book, Pratinav's book, he does not, mention these things the way I am going. As a reader, I would like to comment is basically he's trying to underline the dominant narratives of the era and how that dominant narrative actually became a source to articulate a political position by Muslim elite. So, for example, in 50s and 60s, when Azad was doing the minority right politics, because the constitution was the reference point, and everybody was talking about socialism as a reference point as well. In the late 80s and early 90s, it was secularism, so everybody was talking about secularism. In the 2000, it was inclusiveness. So Muslim inclusion was actually the reference point. And finally, in post 20, not 2014. For me, the reference point is not 14, but 2010. Why 2010? Because 2010 paved the way for the idea of nationalism. Remember one thing, that it was not Narendra Modi who actually brought back the question of constitution or flag, etc., as resources of politics. It was actually India Against Corruption movement, and basically Aam Aadmi Party was the outcome of that movement. So therefore, the resources are important because the resources will shape the discourse. And this is what Anil's book does beautifully. And his lecture captures that in a much nuanced way. These are the three broad comments which I wanted to make. 2 points, Pratinav, and because I am not happy with you. Why? And I'm not happy because I was not expecting you to actually spend a lot of time on colonial India. You should have, take up the question of Pasmanda, take up the question of which are there in the book, and you do, because you are a historian, so you try to contextualize in a historical manner. You could have done it much better, and I would like you to say more on the post-colonial thing, because if I look at the total time you spent on colonial India is much higher than the time you spend on post-colonial India. So please, make me happy. The second comment is, which is a substantial question for you. I really like the idea or the term called betrayal. But betrayal can be understood in two different ways. One way is to look at the betrayal is to look at as a word or a term. But betrayal is also a concept. So how should we look at the idea of betrayal? And your material is actually speaking a lot about it. So I would like you to conceptualize this idea of betrayal in relation to the material which you have. So these are the two questions which I have. I have taken more than 8 minutes. So thank you very much.
Very good concluding remarks. And we will now move to question and answer. But before that, as usual, we have a just a poster for the coming Saturday. But additionally, this is only one time burden to our audience that this is a regular poster for coming Saturday, Intergenerational Dilemmas of Muslim Women in India. It is on feminism and Muslim situation, Muslim women's situation. Professor Huma Ahmed Ghosh is going to speak, and the lone discussant is Professor Shailja Sharma from University of Chicago. But additionally, on great demand, we have on Sunday, next day, one second, Rafat, show me the third slide. We have on Sunday a very special session on dissecting India's stunning election outcome. what challenges lie ahead, and 5 experts, including today's concluding remark. Speaker, Dr. Hilal Ahmed is here, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, all 3 from GNU. Zoya Hassan is a political scientist, well known, and the other husband-wife team is a well-known historian from GNU. Sangeeta Barua Pishrati, she is the National Affairs Editor of The Wire, online wire, much known wire, and Dr. Hilal Ahmed, our Hilal. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for hosting this part of question and answer. Thank you all. Rafat?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. The session is open for the question and answer. And before we begin, I would like to thank all the speakers. It was a wonderful talk. And so let's begin with the question and answer. And you can raise your digital hand or put your question or comment in your chat box. So let's see if there is anything in chat. I have a question. Okay. Abha, please go ahead. And let me read this. So this question is for Pratinav. Since you mentioned that the identity politics takes over the discourse, that gets even more exemplified in post-modern India today. How do you see the Muslim questions dealing with identity and India's neoliberalism that makes lives more vulnerable? So this question is for Prateep. Let's put on.
Right, these are very interesting questions I've had so far. So I think I'm going to begin with Hilal Ahmad's question. And well, first off, mea culpa, you're right. I probably spent too long on the colonial period than the post-colonial one. And I think what I was trying to do here was pick out the origins of Muslim politics and how these ideas come into being. So many people like to just pin on the blame on partition and say this is what it was, and Muslims couldn't really do very much after that. But I want to show that there's actually a lot of continuity between the politics of the 1910s and 20s, which is when Muslim politics really comes into its own, and that casts a shadow over the following century. And what we're doing today is still not very different. So there's that. And coming to the idea of betrayal, so this, you're right to emphasize that this is the key concept underpinning the entire volume. So the reason why I use betrayal is because I want to speak to the idea of class in Islam, and especially in the way class politics transpired in Muslim India. So it would be quite easy for the Ashraf to say this is just Ashraf politics and we're doing this because these are our class interests and we would like to see them represented in parliament and so on. But that is not what they did in the 1950s and 60s. They instead spoke in the language of Islam. So they spoke on the behalf of what were then 60 million Indian Muslims. And by emphasizing the kind of things that they emphasized, Hajj and obscene literature and mutawlis and the like, what they effectively did was they silenced the voices of everyone else in the community, which is why the kind of identity politics that they adopted, to the exclusion of 90% of actually existing Muslims in India, makes me think that they were betrayed in some manner. So it's precisely why I use the term betrayal. Now, coming to the question about neoliberalism, well, that's precisely why you need a subaltern alliance between the Dalits, the OBCs, and the Muslims. You want all the actors who have been dealt a role, who have been dealt a terrible hand in India, to come together and demand higher taxation for the rich. Well, we know famously something like 98% of India doesn't pay taxes, and very many of them tend to be very rich people. So the entire countryside is exempt from taxation, for one thing. So this is precisely what subalterns should be campaigning for, healthcare system, an element of dignity, more education and the like. So I suppose that's the only way you can combat neoliberalism. And given the vagaries of the first past the post system that we have in India, it makes perfect sense to come together and form bigger and bigger alliances. And the 26-party alliance, which, well, didn't quite defeat Modi, but came as close to it as you could in the last 15 years, only underscores the logic of alliance making.
Thank you. Next question is from Dr. Nazir Ahmed and then Dr. Saeed Zadi. Nazir Ahmed sir.
Thank you, Dr. Anil, for a very erudite expose, which was comprehensive, but at the same time, it was incisive. I'm fascinated by your thesis about elite betrayal. And I think you did a great job of tying the historical origins of the predicament that the Muslims in India face. I'd like to ask a question about the Round Table Conference of 1931. It was at that conference when Gandhi made his strategic move to create a majority. Up until that time, if you look at what transpired in the previous conferences, there was no obvious numerical majority in the Round Table Conferences. What fascinates me is that at that conference, we had the presence of Aga Khan, Muhammad Ali brothers were there, Jinnah was there, Allama Iqbal was there, but none of them stood up to Gandhi and held the hand of Ambedkar. What does it say about this elite betrayal at the time? If the betrayal is not only internal of the Muslim community, but was there a betrayal of Ambedkar at the time? What's your thought on that?
Well, the early 30s were a fascinating period for the reasons you describe, and the way Gandhi handled the communal award that Ambedkar was supposed to get with the blackmail of the fast was a particularly sordid episode in Congress history. And I think I completely agree with you on the absence of Muslim support for the cause of the untouchables in 1932. And you see something similar transpire in the Constituent Assembly as well. So this again goes back to the politics of ascription in India. While minorities have been quite vocal in presenting the demands, and they have very rarely built bridges between these communities. And now, if you read Ambedkar's writings, he is quite sympathetic to the Pakistan demand. But at the same time, the way he behaves in the Constituent Assembly tells you, he doesn't have a terribly good view of Muslims himself. And his prejudice towards the scheduled tribes also runs very deep. And so does the prejudice of the Ashraf elite to the scheduled tribes. So as you can see, this again goes back to the original point I was making about the need for subaltern solidarity and why Hindu nationalism has been able to sustain itself as such an important force for so long. Because as we well know that there is no Hindu majority in India, even though 80% of Indians call themselves Hindu, pretty much segmented along caste and class lines. So the only way you can really break that Hindu majority is by wresting away half of the Hindu population and corralling it with an alliance that includes Muslims, Christians, and so on. So you're right, the communal award was one of those pivotal episodes where the dynamic I just described was, well, born.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Saeed Zadi.
Yeah, so very detailed and good talk. Enjoyed it and learned many things. A quick quote I was just reading some time ago and just came. It's by Ashutosh Varshney, professor in Brown University. He said, the longer Hindu nationalists are in power, the greater the change will be to the Muslim status, and the harder it will be to reverse such changes, which probably goes to all the other places where the right radical extreme governments are coming. The question I have is more hypothetical. In my mom's time, my mom and dad migrated to Pakistan. So in 70s and 80s, I heard all the time that I wish I would stay in India, not because of they were deprived of economically or financially. They were probably more prosperous than few people in India, her relatives. But now it's more hypothetical. Now looking at what Pakistan has been going through by own Muslims, how they're deprived and poor condition they are, and now what's going on in last 10, maybe 20 years in India for Muslims. So hypothetically, if Pakistan was India was not partitioned, it would be, of course, still minority, but it will be a very substantial minority. And what difference it would be in this period of time if it was not partitioned? What still will be in the same situation what they are in Muslims in both India and Pakistan now, or it would be different? And second, small question, just a comment from you is, of course, Gandhi has been portrayed as a hero at time of partition, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah was kind of a hard-headed villain and a very stubborn man. And of course, if you read it, it's somewhat in between. So thanks.
Right, well, that's counterfactual you've thrown at me, and I suppose my guess is as good as anyone else's, but I suspect if you had no partition, you wouldn't just have, 200 million Pakistani Muslims in India, but also 200 million Bangladeshi Muslims. So together you'd have something like 600 Muslims in India to about, 1.2 billion Hindus, again, segmented along class lines. So I suppose it would be a lot harder for Hindu nationalism to be the force it's become. It possibly wouldn't have happened the way it did. And it's very likely that religious parties could have, dissolved at some point, and you could have had parties along more or less class lines as you do in most parts of Europe today. So, but then again, we're just throwing darts in the air at this point. There's no real way of knowing what could have happened and what couldn't.
Thank you. And the next question is in the chat box from Anil. Can association of Mahatma with Muslim clerics in around 1920 be seen as a reason of RSS coming into being?
Right. Okay. So the thing is, the world didn't exactly begin in 1920, as we well know. So Hindu nationalism was certainly Hindu revivalism and Hindu traditionalism, the older declensions to what would go on to become Hindu nationalism, were already there in the 1860s and 1870s. So I think the real problem is not Muslim clerics, but the way devolution unfolded. So when elite politics could no longer be simply elite, and you had to speak to people, who generally didn't have the same vested interests that the elites did, you have to develop a more demotic idiom of having politics, So, of course, cow slaughter becomes a big thing in the 1860s and 1870s. And that's when Muslim clerics start to dabble in politics themselves. They step out of the madrasas and move into the public sphere. So these forces are, both of these developments are happening at roughly the same time. So, it's not a chicken and egg situation. It's more about how the currents of politics evolved in the 1860s and 70s. And I think it's important to recognize that both Muslim fundamentalism and Hindu fundamentalism developed in response to one another. None of them really came first, you see.
Rafat?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So there, I don't see, I'm looking at it, but in the meantime, I request Dr. Abdul Jabbar.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for a remarkable presentation. So there's something me from the South, India, Tamil Nadu, kind of, it's a lesson for me in terms of the whole picture of Muslims in India post and colonial as well as pre-colonial times, eras. So I kind of go back to Professor Ahmed's intriguing question about AMU. I'm far away from AMU. I'm in Tamil Nadu South, and the outreach to the community surrounding the AMU campus. You had an interview with somebody. It didn't mean anything to them, apparently. The larger context. What does it mean to be AMU sitting in next to them in the community? But I think that's what I thought that's what you're referring to, how the elite institutions, even though it's a minority institution, but the community is also, I think Muslim community surrounding the institution, they didn't feel very attached to the institution. So I think that is very intriguing, kind of the height of betrayal. I think that's what you're alluding to in your book, I think. So then when it comes to the recent election, I was reading about Ayodhya. Ayodhya, apparently BJP did not win in that constituency, including Ayodhya, in spite of remarkable function they had in January. There's also some community was feeling Ayodhya is great for international exposure to the rest of the world, the rest of the country, but locally we don't feel anything special about the new temple. So there is some sort of remarkable people, ordinary people, that is I thought about that. Elites, they don't seem to really understand the psyche of ordinary Indians. Can you kind of comment on that a little bit? Because I spoke a little bit longer than I usually do. I was fascinated by I'm looking for your book. The next India, right? So that's the one. Thank you.
Right, and yeah, you're quite right to say that local politics tend to follow different cadences from national politics. And I think that's for very good reason, because local concerns tend not to be national ones. So while you may promise national renewal through the construction of a temple, someone sitting in Ayodhya itself would probably be more interested in knowing, what are you going to do about the land he's been dispossessed from? Will you be giving him a different piece of land? And how are things going to work out for him? So, well, the material is still more important than the ideological. And this again comes back to the main point I was making about elite Muslim politics. It's really goes down to its inability to speak to working class Muslims, the Ajlaf and the Arsal and so on. And well, I hope you enjoy my book.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. So next question is for you, Dr. Anil, and it is from Salman Qureshi Saab. Were the portions removed by Nehru from Azad's book that you mentioned finally published in later edition, or were they lost for posterity.
Right, so Azad was the Congress president from 1939 to 46, but he didn't have very much power in those years. He's essentially a puppet being maneuvered by Nehru and Gandhi, who, as I said, were even vetting his correspondence, and they pretty much didn't allow him to do anything. So he criticized the Congress very heavily for its fairly Hindu nationalist government between 1937 and 1939. There's 2 years when they were in power before they resigned when the war began. And then he also criticized the Congress's handling of the cabinet mission plan. So this was the last time when a single united India was possible, and this is what Azad was very much behind, but not so much Gandhi and Nehru. So again, they threw him under the bus. So these were the two episodes he highlighted, and he also went on to show how partition was manhandled by Congress elites. So put together, there was about 30 pages of incendiary material that Nehru just struck his blue pen over. And this was in 1958. And 30 years later, his manuscript was found at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And that's when the unredacted version was published. And you can find that online now on a website called archive.org, should you fancy to look into it.
Thank you. Razibhai, if you wish, I can put few people on the spot.
Yes, please do so.
Okay. Iltifat Hassan. And then maybe Sayyid Amir Saab. I have to look. He's there.
I'm here. Yes, Rafat. Yes.
Go ahead.
So I can go ahead. I have a question that has been bothering me for a long time, and it's going back in history. But sorry, two questions. One is I have talked to some of my colleagues, Indian colleagues, who consistently say that the problem with Congress was that they used to cater to the Muslim demands a lot, and as a result, they were neglected. They were favoring Muslims way too much. And what BJP is doing is much better, that they are cutting Muslims out of the whole political process and making progress. So can I get an answer to this question? Is there any merit in saying that Congress was too dependent on Muslims and catered to their demands way too much?
Well, all I can say is Muslims were getting, well, the Congress was getting something like 45 to 50% of the popular vote in the 1950s and early 60s, when Muslims accounted for a mere 7% of Indians. So clearly a lot of people were fairly happy with Congress rule, and the bulk of them happened not to be Muslim. So I really see I don't think there's any credence to that claim at all. One may make the claim that the Congress didn't do very much for most people by keeping a really small state, refusing to expand welfare, refusing to redistribute land, as so many other East Asian societies did. So that's a different conversation, though. That's a conversation about class power and state power rather than religious preference, because when it comes to that, as I've outlined in my book and this talk, Muslims didn't have it well at all. If anything, the Congress was deeply Islamophobic, and it was very much Hindu majoritarian rule, if not in the same key that you see today.
Okay,
Thank you.
That's what I thought. And I have just one follow-up question, if I can, Rafat.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this is a question that we cannot undo anything what has happened in history, but was formation of Pakistan, the partition of India, the catalyst for all of this which is happening now? Had partition not happened, none of this would have come to pass, and Muslims would be about 400 million more Muslims in a combined India than we have today.
Well, as I pointed out in the talk, many of the things we describe about Muslim politics were already there in the 1920s and 30s. So, a certain style of Muslim politics had already developed by then, and that wasn't going to go anywhere, partition or no partition. But at the same time, you're right to emphasize the fact that if there were 600 million Muslims today, Modi's vote share would be a lot smaller. His kind of politics wouldn't have been able to develop the way it did. I mean, a lot of the BJP's politics hinges on the fact that Pakistan is a neighbor, which is why you need a strong military, high defense spending, surgical strikes every now and then, and in general, stirring hatred between the two communities. So that kind of politics would not be absent today, because you had it in the 20s and 30s, and there's a fair amount of religious violence during late colonial India. There's no point in pretending that late colonial India was some kind of golden age for Hindu-Muslim relations. But I suspect Muslims wouldn't have been in such a bad predicament in India today if there were about 600 million of them in the country.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rapat.
Thank you. Amir Saab.
Thank you. First of all, I have a comment and then I have a question. I'm a little confused about your comment, and I think somebody else also, that Nehru ordered some portions of the book removed from Maulana Azad's book. As far as I know, the Maulana Azad's last book was India Wins Freedom, which was translated by Professor Humayun Kabir. The only small parts of that book was removed during on the instructions of Maulana Azad himself, and he wanted that to be brought back after his death, from 25, 30 years ago, whatever. His concern was that the comments concerned some politicians at the time, and he didn't want to offend them, or so that what happened. The complete book is now available, and I have read it, and anybody can read it. India Wins Freedom. These comments relate mostly one or two about Pandit Nehru, but nothing very innocuous. A little bit more biting about Sardar Patel and his actions immediately after partition during the riots in Delhi. So that is as far as I know, but I don't think Pandit Nehru had any involvement in removing those pages. It was Maulana himself. Now, my question is that I think it was mentioned, I think Professor Lal Ahmed, that during the Muslim period, I mean, I would say mostly Mughal period, and probably is not fair to say that this in any way with Islamic dominance. During that period, although it was during the Shah Jahan and Akbar's reign, was one of the richest country in the world, but that richness did not descend to the common person. There was Hindus and there were Muslims who was poor and deprived, and there was Hindus and Muslims who were elite and high-powered. And so it wasn't a discriminatory situation. But what I want to know is your thoughts, is such being the situation, how after the partition, and even, I mean, I must say, not say, after the end of the Muslim rule or British ascendancy, it became easier for some selfish, unscrupulous politicians to spread this myth that it was a Muslim rule and Muslims were privileged, while the facts do not support that. And why the counter narrative has not been successful. Muslims and others who would provide a rebuttal to that doesn't seem to have taken hold. Thank you.
Right, so let's start with Azad. I suspect, well, the simple fact is Nehru was very much involved in redacting the diaries. I've seen Nehru's letters to and fro with Humayun Kabir, and you can see them as well at the Nehru NMML in Delhi. So you see the 30 pages, all of which were redacted. You can find them all in the papers of Azad. So you say Humayun Kabir was Azad's translator, but actually was more of a stenographer. So Azad was losing his eyesight by 1957. So he was essentially dictating his memories to Humayun Kabir, who was writing them up. So when Azad died, the idea was he was supposed to publish the entire thing as a single volume. Now, Humayun Kabir belonged to that style of Muslim politics that I described earlier, rather circumspect and all of that, which is why he went to Nehru and he asked him, this is what he says about you. By the way, there's quite a lot of nasty comments about Nehru in the 30 pages. And you're right, it's been published in 1988, and you can find all of this online. And he had some rather nice comments about the British as well. So this too upset Nehru's sensibilities. So, there are three things there. He's giving Jinnah a bit of a fair pass. He was dissing Nehru, and he was rather favorable to the Brits. So put them all together and you can see why a nationalist of Nehru's bent wasn't too happy with the way the whole affair transpired. So and these were the passages that were redacted, and yes, you can read them all in 1988. Now, coming to the Mughals, I think that's precisely the point which Hilal Ahmad was trying to make, that, class counted for a lot more than religion in Mughal India. And I think there has been a fair amount of pushback. Now, if you read some of the works of Irfan Habib, for instance, they're all about land tenure and the way the class system evolved in early modern India under the Mughals. So possibly you're right in suggesting that none of this historical research has reached the level of public consciousness. And I think historians can hardly be blamed for that. That's something, journalists should be disseminating, political activists of every stripe. You probably need liberal WhatsApp forward groups. And of course, you possibly need more engaged historians. But I think this is well-trodden ground. Historians have emphasized time and again that not all Muslims were living in palaces in Mughal India, and it would be a bit of a stretch for anyone to believe that, really.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Anil. So one last question from chat box from 101, someone. What explained Ambedkar's comments against Muslims, although he got into Constituent Assembly by support of Muslim League?
Well, Ambedkar was something of a universalist. His politics turned on ideas of, citizenship and so on. And he was well aware that most of the Muslim elites were not oppressed figures. And, the very idea of Muslim backwardness, which was mobilized by the Muslim elites, didn't have very much going for it. So when this myth was propagated for the first time in the 1880s, it was possibly true of Bengal, but it was never true of the United Provinces, where it was put forth with the most vehemence, which is why you found the Muslim League being born there in 1906. So I suppose Ambedkar was reacting to two things here. So one was the class element of Muslim politics, and he's quite right to suggest that Dalits were truly oppressed in a manner that the Muslim elites weren't. And secondly, I think it was just a common reflex of the time. Very few communities, very few people had a sense of fellow feeling with other communities. And, even some of the greatest thinkers of this period fall short of our expectations on that front, not least Gandhi, and even in some measure Nehru, who had his own Kashmiri prejudices. And I suppose we can talk about that at greater length when we meet the next time.
Thank you. So Dr. Nazir Ahmad raised his hand again.
I have a quick comment on India wins freedom. Dr. Humayun Kabir visited the United States in 1969. We had organized a convention of the first Indian Muslim organization here in North America called CCIM, or Consultative Committee of Indian Muslims. I was one of the conveners, and I had an opportunity to sit right across Dr. Humayun Kabir and discuss some of these issues. First of all, a comment about Dr. Kabir himself, a consummate scholar with completely at ease discussing Shakespeare and Bhagavad Gita all in the same breath, and a man of integrity. Now, one thing he pointed out was that when Maulana Azad passed away in 1958, there were riots in central India. Really, I remember in 1960, 61, that era, very bad riots. And this convention that we had was also in the background of devastating riots, Hindu-Muslim riots in central India. So he pointed out that, yes, indeed, there are passages that we have withheld, and that is to maintain the equanimity, the intercommunal peace, first of all, before the passing away of Nehru, and even after that.
Thank you.
I thought you do mention the Jabalpur riots of 1961, which, if I recall correctly, began with a 6-year-old Muslim boy taunting a 90-year-old Hindu woman, and then things spiraled out of control. Well, my basic point is, it's rather absurd to think that an unredacted edition of Azad's book, which was mostly about 30s interprovincial politics, could have possibly led to more communal violence in 1958 or 1961. So I don't think they were trying to manage communal sensibilities by redacting the book. And let us remember that something like 85% of Indians were illiterate at this point. So, I don't think very many of them would have been buying Azad's book and stoking riots after reading that. So I really think this comes down to the way Nehru wanted his image and his policy's image and the run-up to partition and the nationalist movement to be remembered.
If I may add, I don't think there is any disagreement about some parts of that freedom, India wins freedom, were withheld. But the issue is whether it was Maulana Azad's directive himself or it was on Nehru's insistence. In my case, whatever little I know, it was Maulana himself who had directed that.
Thank you, Amir Bhai, for your comment. Last invite to our own Dr. Tariq Farooqi, if he wants to say something, and otherwise.
Hilal Ahmed himself, the speaker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, just to add to the last question, basically, you mentioned about Jabalpur riot and the formation of All India Muslim Majlis-e-Mushawarat. I think we have to also look at the context in which the Mushawarat was formed. That was not only one riot, but there were a series of communal events that took place from 61 to 62. And I think that in that context, it became very important to have, it is actually an interesting move from earlier position when Azad was alive and the position where a kind of a coalition is needed, not merely of one kind of people who would call themselves nationalist, but also a coalition of different Muslim voices. And this is precisely the manner in which Mushawarat came to existence. What is interesting is that after, say, for instance, in 3 years' time, the politics of Mushawarat changed quite interestingly. And I would like to mention here that in 1967, when Majlis was formed as a political party in UP, Mushawarat came out with an interesting political strategy. And the strategy was that they decided to support the non-Congress candidates in both in the Lok Sabha and coming Vidhan Sabha election. What is fascinating in this, that there was a tacit support for a candidate whose political affiliation was not clear. So many thought that he was an RSS Jansangh person in one of the constituency, and that because of that confusion, that person was also supported by the Majlis in that election. It shows that anti-Congressism, something which was a very powerful political narrative that evolved after the death of Nehru, played a very significant role in the changing manner in which Muslim politics was played out. Thank
Thank you. And that concludes the session, question and answer session. Let me ask a question, and then it's not to Dr. Raziuddin. So there were some comments made that if there was undivided India, Muslims would have been like a 600 million people or so. So my hypothetical question is whether the BJP would have been in power in that situation. This is just I am thinking whether it was even possible.
Well, I think the BJP would have certainly existed because there was always a constituency of Hindu nationalism and Hindu revivalism. And well, the Akhadas go back to 1925 when India is very much a united country. And you also see the roots of the Hindu Mahasabha in the 20s and 30s. So, of course, that kind of politics wouldn't have gone away. You know, it would have probably been less influential, and it would have been forced to moderate some of its demands a lot earlier. So possibly a figure like Vajpayee or someone, in fact, a lot more moderate than Vajpayee would have been is sitting in Parliament today and would have been India's prime minister. I certainly think a figure like Modi would have been impossible in a country with 600 million Muslims. You know, you would have possibly had to speak to at least a few of them as a Hindu nationalist.
Yeah, thank you. Because their vote share is around 35%, and that would have been very difficult. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone. Back to Dr. Raziuddin. He must have a lot of questions.
No, I'm not. I'm also very fascinated with these same question coming to you on and on with this nostalgia, of, well, sort of nostalgia that had we not had this partition. So whether Muslims and Hindus both were better off as two people coming together, or politically Muslims were more influential. Probably Muslims have tasted blood in this 24 election. They know their value, that, Muslim Mukt Bharat of BJP became the real problem for BJP, that they consolidated and gave a thumping majority and helped gain the thumping majority in many other places in winning the seats. Imagine in an undivided India, and Assam and Bengal and Punjab, with much more Muslim population than non-Muslims. It would have been impossible for any Hindu party. Probably now, if there is a movement to have a federation of both, probably a movement will come from BJP not to have such a federation. Not to have such a federation, probably. No mention in most of the speakers on Indian politics, subcontinent politics, never the role of South Indian Muslims, what they were doing. I mean, the Ashraf of South India,
right.
Were they not totally insignificant? I mean, in Karnataka,
so the Muslim League was actually quite influential in Madras and in parts of Hyderabad as well. So, in fact, the idea was, when Pakistan was still not a concrete piece of two contiguous lands in northeastern and northwestern India, you would have little pools of Pakistan across the country. So you would have a Moplastan and Osmanistan in the south. So that was the thinking, which is why very many Muslims, especially of a certain landed class were behind this idea, and very many of them voted the League in the 37 and 46 elections. But when it became very clear after, well, the Mountbatten Plan, really, as late as that in the summer of 1947, what Pakistan was actually going to look like, that's when many of them decided to distance themselves from the North Indian leadership of the Muslim League. So they had a meeting in Madras in the winter of 1948, where they officially split the two Muslim leagues. The AIMIL was born. And that's the Muslim League that you see today in Kerala. So it's effectively a successor party.
So when you say Madras, that means the Madras presidency of that time, which included Karnataka Muslims also, basically.
No.
Yes, and parts of Kerala as well outside Malabar.
Outside Malabar.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying technically, but
can I kind of, because I'm a Muslim in Tamil Nadu, I read about, I went to a Muslim college, Trichy, Jamamon College. I recently learned about the historian, J.P. Moore, French historian, written about the founder of the Jamamon College, also Muhammad al-Jinnah. So he talks about what you are talking about the Madras presidency. There is a division among Muslims, Tamil-speaking Muslims, and the Urdu-speaking Muslims. And then Jamal Muhammad, the founder of the Jamamon College, was against partition. He was proposing this is a divisive for India. The partition will create problems for Muslims all over the India. Exactly what he was very prophetic, apparently. That is the discussion. I think Razuddin Sahab, we should have the discussion. I will bring that historian, French historian, for the discussion. Okay, so this is my promise. If you could promise me for a discussion on the South Indian context in the pre and post independent India, we will have that one.
okay, thank you. I mean, the debate is on and on, that the bulk of the discussion, not only with you, in most of cases that we have, whenever we bring the political aspect or the division or the partition or the roles, plenty of Muslims live in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Nizam's Hyderabad, which was a lot of portion of Maharashtra, modern day. They were there. But we never hear anything, even the speakers never mention or give any reference about them. Or not only for the Muslims, even for the Hindus of South India. I mean, what was the role of this before DMK was formed and other things? Even the Congress was, Kamraj was there, Rajaji was from there, many other were there. What were their roles? I mean, it looks like from everything stops on Vindhyachal, and after that really becomes a regional thing. And
Rajibai, the reason I think is that Muslims' situation in India is mostly associated with the partition.
yes, that's the question. That what was the role of not only Muslims, what was the role of even Hindus of South India?
Because they did not play any major role in the partition.
Probably they were not discussed. What really did they
Well,
do?
maybe Abdul Jabbar Sahab can tell if there are
all the focus remains on this, the Vindhyachal division, anything central and north is
because it was close to the Pakistan border, and most of the Muslim leagues were active in North India.
But they were also active, that's what we are saying, they were also active in Madras presidency, they were active in Hyderabad, the Nizam's area, they were very active, but they are not discussed, that's what I'm saying. They were very active, Muslim League. And
so invite Abdul Jabbar and someone.
Not only Jabbar, yes, of course.
Ask him to explore
I have put that one. Please give me the opportunity to bring
and Nazir Sahab
more to discuss this topic. I'm not a
No,
historian.
I
I'm a
mean,
biologist.
I mean, this is unofficial, it's a really that kind of.
May I?
What happened to Congress role in that area? Rajaji, Kamraj, and others.
He will bring that perspective. JP Moore will bring the perspective what you're asking. I think Dr. Nazis Mahamas is trying to make some points, I think.
Okay.
If I may.
Look, the South Indians are taken over right now.
Yeah, Razi Saab, I'm old enough to practically become a history by myself. I was 8 years old when partition took place. I'll relate this for this distinguished audience that will illustrate and give an answer that has been raised. On August 16, 1946, when Jinnah asked the Muslims in India to protest, I remember we lived in a Muslim locality. I'm from Karnataka, by the way, Dr. Anil, and I'm a former member, elected member of the Karnataka Legislative Assembly, etc., etc. Anyway, so I remember going up with my grandfather on the roof of our house, which was built of black tiles. There was not one single person who had hoisted a black flag of protest, except one guy. Now he raised his flag, and within about 5 minutes, 20 people pulled it down. The Congress movement in the state of Mysore was very strong. The Muslim League movement in the state of Mysore was very weak. We must remember that South India at the time was composed of Hyderabad, Mysore, Travancore, and the Madras Presidency. And the movement had different color in each of these areas. We can talk about Hyderabad very differently, but succinctly. Most of the Muslims in Mysore state, I can state that with some confidence, were strongly with the Congress Party and the Congress movement.
Right, yeah. Well, the Congress was, of course, a much stronger force than the League was in the South, but you can't quite write out people like Ismail from the discussion. Ismail Khan, Beg, Fakhr, Imam, Karimuddin, there are a lot of Southern Leaguers who were important figures in the 1930s and 40s, and they did command a significant following. And all of these figures eventually made it to the Constituent Assembly as well. And they were the only ones calling for reservations for Muslims in the manner that the Dalits had been given. So I think there was an assertive brand of Muslim League politics that has been omitted or written out of history over the last few decades because of, nationalism, really. But I think it's important to remember that, the Southern question was not missing in the 1940s. A lot of people were debating it. Even Ambedkar was writing quite a bit about it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this is almost more than 2 hours.
Yes, that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Anil, Dr. Rahman, and Professor Rahman, and of course, Professor Ahmad Ilal Ahmad Saab. It was, it always generates a lot of question when you talk about India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I think it is time that we bring the Southern.
Yeah, that's what I am saying.
All people,
Yes, I agree.
Okay, we will
be ready.
So Rafat, before you leave, because the second question was not answered, I asked.
No, this is too late now.
Huh? It was a short question.
Okay.
What's that? Go ahead.
The one question I asked you, because of course the movie and the drama and all that showed that Jinnah was kind of a stubborn, hard-headed kind of a villain portrayed, and Gandhi was more like a hero. So Anil, can you please?
That is
Well, history doesn't admit heroes. No one's a hero.
yeah.
History
is different than movie.